There are stories that refuse to fade, even when time does its best to bury them. This one begins in a forgotten corner of Ohio, where the soil still remembers the weight of chains long rusted, and the air carries the faint echo of promises never kept. It is the story of a woman called Lady Adeline Heir, the last daughter of a name once spoken with reverence, then whispered with fear. They say she returned to her ancestral home after years abroad, drawn not by comfort, but by something unsettled, something that would not let her sleep. The townspeople did not welcome her with warmth. To them, she was a ghost wearing fine gloves, walking through the ashes of her father's sins. They remembered the Heir plantation as a place where freedom arrived late and left early. Where debt was another word for captivity, and mercy was rationed like grain. Adeline never spoke of the past. She stepped through the crumbling gates as though nothing had changed, as though she had been gone only a day. Her eyes met the old house, its windows dull and watching, its walls breathing faintly with the dust of old breath. There was no laughter in those halls now, no music. Only silence, stretched so thin it trembled. The people in town watched from a distance. Some pitied her, others despised her. They said a woman alone on cursed land would soon hear voices not her own. Yet Adeline hired one man to bring the house back to life, a young worker from the edge of town, known simply as Samuel. He arrived without question, carrying tools wrapped in cloth, his manner quiet, his gaze firm. The arrangement seemed ordinary enough. He was to mend the broken floors, clear the rot, and make the house livable again. But as the days passed, something unseen began to stir. He noticed how the lady never stayed in the same room for long, how her eyes drifted toward the second floor whenever the wind pressed against the windows. At night, faint footsteps crossed the corridor, steady, patient, measured. When he looked the next morning, there were no prints in the dust. Adeline spoke little. When she did, her words felt rehearsed, as though she were repeating lines written long before she was born. Samuel sensed there was a question she wanted to ask him, but never could. There was history between them, though neither dared name it. For every wall he repaired, there was another she seemed afraid to touch. One afternoon, while the sun hung low and heavy, Samuel found a small brass key resting on a cracked windowsill. It was old, the kind no modern lock would use. He brought it to her, but she froze at the sight of it. Her voice broke slightly as she said, "Keep it. If the house wishes to open something, it will." He did not understand her meaning, but he pocketed the key. That night, he could not sleep. The air had changed, thick with a heaviness that pressed on his chest. He walked the hall with a lantern, passing the same portraits that had watched him since his first day. Generations of Heirs looked down at him with painted smiles that had never reached their eyes. At the end of the hall, behind a curtain of cobwebs, he saw a door that should not have been there. It was narrow, almost hidden, the wood darker than the rest, as though it had absorbed more than its share of years. The key fit without effort. When the lock turned, the sound echoed like a sigh, and the door opened to a room untouched by time. Inside were shelves upon shelves of boxes, photographs, and journals. On the walls hung framed portraits, sepia faces arranged with pride and precision. In each, the Heir ancestors stood tall in pressed suits and gowns, and beside them stood the nameless workers who had tilled their land. Some smiled faintly, others stared straight ahead, but their eyes, every single one, seemed fixed on Samuel. He stepped closer, tracing the edge of a frame with his finger. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been. Beneath the photographs lay ledgers filled with names, hundreds of them, dates, numbers, notes in neat cursive. Debts owed, lives measured, humanity recorded in ink as inventory. He stood there for a long while, unable to move, the weight of the room pressing against him. Somewhere below, a single piano note drifted through the air, soft, wavering, uncertain. It was followed by another, and another. The melody was neither joyful nor sorrowful, it felt like confession. When morning came, the room was locked once more. The key was gone. Adeline did not ask about it, and Samuel did not mention what he had seen. Yet something in her eyes had changed. She carried herself like a woman who could hear things others could not, like the creak of the stairs beneath footsteps that were no longer there, or the soft whisper of her family's names being called from somewhere deep beneath the earth. As the days grew longer, Samuel began to notice small details that unsettled him. The mirrors were always covered with cloth, the clocks never ticked, and though the candles burned, their wax never melted. Every morning, she stood by the window overlooking the fields, staring at nothing. Sometimes her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. There was a night when he found her standing at the threshold of the locked room again, though the key had vanished days ago. Her hand rested against the wood, her forehead pressed to it, as though she were listening. When he spoke her name, she turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "The house remembers," she said. "Even if I try to forget, it won't." And then she walked away. Samuel wanted to leave. Every instinct told him to pack his things and never return. But something, perhaps pity, perhaps curiosity, held him there. He began reading the names he had seen in those ledgers aloud, softly, one by one, each evening after his work. He said them into the empty rooms, the halls, the stairwell. And with each name, the air seemed lighter, as though the house itself exhaled. By the end of the week, the piano stopped playing on its own. The portraits no longer appeared to follow him with their gaze. And Adeline, Lady Harrow, began sleeping through the night for the first time since her return. But the silence that settled over the estate was not peace. It was remembrance. Because some homes are not haunted by the dead. They are haunted by the living who refuse to acknowledge them. They say memory is a living thing, not bound to the mind that holds it. It lingers in walls, in trees, in the soil that once drank blood and sweat alike. And on that land, Lady Adeline Harrow began to remember, not through dreams, but through what the world around her refused to let her forget. The days had grown heavy with quiet. The rooms no longer spoke in creaks and whispers, now, they watched in silence. The workers in town refused to come near the estate. Some claimed the house moaned at dusk, others that lanterns glowed in windows long shattered. The pastor warned his congregation that the land was unsettled, though he never said why. And still, Adeline remained. Samuel tried to keep to his work, but each task seemed to reveal another piece of history he did not wish to see. In the attic, he found trunks filled with letters bearing the Harrow seal, pages of inked promises that looked noble at first, employment offers, apprenticeships, adoptions. But the language twisted in the details. Each signature led to a contract of debt. Each debt chained a person to the Harrow name. Freedom disguised as favor. Choice rewritten as gratitude. He brought the letters to her in the parlor. She was seated at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys without pressing them, as if the instrument might shatter beneath her touch. He laid the pages beside her and waited. When she looked down, her expression did not change. Her voice was calm, but there was tremor behind the calm. "You think I didn't know?" she said. "I grew up hearing how generous my family was. How many lives we saved. But when you tell a lie often enough, it begins to sound like truth." Samuel asked why she had returned to this place if she knew. Her answer came slow, careful, measured, because every name in those papers was stolen to build mine. He wanted to believe she spoke out of remorse. But remorse alone did not explain why she stayed. The land was dying, the walls were sinking. What did she hope to find? The following weeks drew curious eyes from the town. Gossip traveled faster than wind. They said the lady was seeing ghosts, that she'd gone mad from guilt, that the worker had bewitched her with talk of old graves. Farmers who passed the road at night swore they saw candles burning across the fields, arranged in circles, glowing until dawn. Inside, their conversations grew longer, their silences deeper. She began telling him things that had no place in daylight. How her mother vanished one winter, leaving only a shawl on the gate, how her father spoke to empty chairs at dinner, how every Harrow child was taught to memorize the names of the people who once served them, not out of respect, but to remember ownership. They called it heritage, she said. I called it inheritance. Samuel said little. He had no wish to argue with grief disguised as penance. But each story drew him closer to the truth he had sensed since the first day: the house was not merely filled with ghosts, it was built on them. One morning, rain came in sheets, hammering the windows until the sky disappeared. The roof leaked, and he climbed to the upper floor to seal the cracks. There, behind the false wall of the library, he found something the house had hidden too well: an iron chest bound with leather, its lock eaten by rust. Inside were ledgers, deeds, and letters marked confidential to the Harrow line. They told of land sales, of labor lists, of payments exchanged for silence. Every column, every entry, bore the same inked mark at the top: her father's name. And beneath it, figures so large they could have purchased towns. Among the papers was one document unlike the rest. It bore her own name, written in a trembling hand, the inheritance passed down to her before she was even born. The wealth, the property, the estate, all traced back to labor that was never paid for, to generations who had worked under false mercy. Every coin in her fortune was stamped with a debt unpaid. When he brought the papers to her, she did not speak. She simply looked at them, then at him, and the silence between them thickened like fog. The clock in the hall struck noon, but the sound seemed hollow, distant. She whispered, I wanted to restore what was lost, but it seems what was lost was never mine to begin with. He asked her then, softly, why stay on ground that was built on grief? She answered, because leaving it means letting the lie win. The rain stopped. Outside, the air hung still, heavy, waiting. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere deep within the walls, something gave a slow, deliberate sigh, as though the past itself had been listening all along. There are nights when the air itself seems to breathe, when silence feels too alive to be empty. It was on such nights that the house began to speak again. Not through wind or echo, but through voices that did not belong to the living. At first, Lady Adeline thought the sounds were dreams slipping into wakefulness, a hum beneath the floorboards, the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing the corridor above her room. But when she rose and found no one there, when the footsteps continued even as she stood beneath them, she understood it was not her mind that was restless. It was the house. The voices came next. They were soft, threaded through the night air like smoke. Names, fragments of songs, words in languages that time had tried to erase. They spoke to each other, not to her. But when she listened long enough, one voice would always rise above the others, close enough to feel its breath on her ear. It whispered her name, not with anger, but with exhaustion, as though calling her was a burden that had been carried for too long. Samuel began to hear them too. He would stop his work, head tilted, waiting for the faint echo that drifted from the earth outside. The sound was not wind. It was rhythm, steady, measured, like hands striking wood or tools hitting soil. When he told her, she did not laugh, did not doubt. She only said, they are reminding us where we stand. The next morning, he walked to the edge of the property where the field met the woods. The ground dipped slightly, uneven and pale, as though the soil refused to grow. There were no markers, no stones, no sign of memory. But the air there was heavy and cold, colder than the morning should have allowed. When he knelt and pressed his hand to the dirt, it felt soft, too soft, as if something beneath it had long since turned to dust. He returned to her, his face drawn and pale. There are people buried here, he said. She closed her eyes, as though she had known it all along. He told me once, she murmured. My father. He said the land was sacred. I never asked for whom. Word spread quickly through the town. They said Samuel was digging up the past to shame the living. They said the lady had lost her reason. The sheriff came on horseback, his hat low over his eyes, his tone sharp with the weight of authority. You're disturbing the soil of this county, he told Samuel. You'll find nothing good in that ground. But Samuel did not stop. With each strike of the shovel, the air seemed to thicken, the light grow dimmer. The first bones appeared small, fragile, folded inward as though they had tried to shield themselves from the earth. Then came others, larger, broken, tangled together with fragments of cloth long turned to dust. Adeline stood over the grave, her face white as salt. The wind moved through the trees like the hush of 1,000 breaths. When she spoke, her voice was thin, hollow, they were never given names. Only numbers. That night, she could not sleep. The voices returned, louder now, clearer. They filled the halls, the rooms, the mirrors. Each one spoke a truth the family had buried for generations. And among them, one voice stood apart, deep, commanding, cruelly familiar. It called her by the name only her father had used when she was a child. She followed the sound to the old study, where his portrait still hung. The painted eyes glinted in the lantern's light, and for a moment, they seemed alive. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the wood, the walls, the floor. You shame our blood, it said. You unearth what was meant to rest. Her breath caught in her throat. They were never meant to rest, she whispered back. They were buried to be forgotten. The laughter that answered her was low and bitter. Do you think their bones forgive you, it said. Do you think the soil is absolved? She sank to the floor, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the portrait. The painted mouth seemed to curl into a smile. Then the light flickered and went out. When morning came, Samuel found her outside by the field, barefoot, her dress stained with dirt. The grave was open before her, the bones laid bare beneath the grey dawn. She knelt beside them, her voice faint, trembling, almost reverent. They never left us, she said. And for the first time since her return, the land was quiet, not peaceful, but waiting. As though the earth itself had paused to hear what she would say next. Morning came without color, as though the sky itself had emptied. The house stood still, its doors open, its windows bare. For the first time in decades, the curtains had been drawn back to let the light in. It fell across the floors like a hesitant guest, uncertain if it was welcome. Lady Adeline Heir had not slept since the night she found the grave. She spent the hours before dawn writing, letters, notices, invitations. Her handwriting, once elegant, shook as though each word cost her strength. By midday, the messenger had delivered her call throughout the town. The same people who had once whispered about her madness now read her summons with disbelief. She had invited them all, the families whose ancestors had worked her family's fields, the preachers, the elders, the children, to stand with her on the land where their names had been buried. When they arrived, they came in quiet clusters. Some carried flowers. Others carried nothing but the weight of memory. Samuel stood among them, silent, his eyes watching the house that had swallowed so many truths. The grave lay open still, the bones now covered in linen and marked with stones bearing no names. The wind was low, gentle, almost kind. Adeline stepped forward. She wore plain clothes, stripped of silk and lace. Her hair was unbound, her face drawn but calm. No title clung to her now. She spoke without the tremor of fear, though her voice carried the sound of years unspoken. My family built their pride on your suffering, she said. They called it inheritance. They told me it was an honor. I called it silence. But the ground has reminded me that silence is not peace. It is debt. Her words hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. No one moved. Only the sound of the wind moving through the grass gave reply. She continued, every coin, every acre, every stone of this house was bought with what could never be repaid. And so today, I return it. This land, this name, this house, none of it belongs to me. It belongs to the truth. From her coat, she withdrew a single folded document and placed it on the earth beside the grave. The paper bore her signature, her fortune surrendered to a historical trust that would preserve the land not as a monument to her lineage, but as a memorial for the people who had lived and died upon it. There was no applause, no words of comfort. Only a long silence that seemed to stretch into the bones of the earth. Then Samuel stepped forward. He looked at her not as servant or savior, but as witness. "You cannot change what they did," he said quietly. "But you chose to face what they made. That's more than most ever have." Her eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with something gentler, release. "Do you forgive me?" she asked. He shook his head. "I forgive the choice you made to stop pretending." The sun broke through the clouds then, slow and hesitant, its light falling across the grave, the house, the gathered crowd. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint warmth, and for a moment the field seemed to breathe again. The air no longer felt heavy. The silence no longer pressed. Those who had come began to hum softly, a tune without words, something older than grief and lighter than mourning. Adeline closed her eyes. For the first time since her return, she felt the land beneath her feet as something living, not accusing. Later, when the people had gone and only Samuel remained, they stood together before the grave. The grass moved gently, as though the earth were exhaling after a long confinement. "The house will stand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it will never belong to the Harrows again." Samuel looked toward the horizon, where the light was settling over the fields. "It never truly did." And with that, the last echo faded. The voices quieted, the air cleared. The weight that had lingered for generations lifted, leaving behind only the sound of wind through clean air and a faint promise of peace. The land, at last, was light. Time has a way of softening even the hardest stories, yet some truths do not fade, they mature like scars, visible reminders that healing once had to happen. Generations have passed since that day on the Harrow land. The old estate still stands, but its windows now look out on classrooms instead of fields, its halls filled with quiet footsteps of visitors who come not to forget, but to learn. The place is no longer a monument to wealth, it is a keeper of memory. I am Nathan Harrow Smith, great-grandson of the man once called Samuel. My family stayed near these grounds, tending to them, protecting them, ensuring the past would never again be sealed behind walls or silence. What was once a house of pain became a place of truth. We named it the Fields of Memory. When you walk its corridors now, you can still hear the faint creak of the floorboards where they first met, the low hum of the wind that once carried their voices. The room that once held the photographs now holds a gallery of names, etched in brass, illuminated by morning light. Each name a life once forgotten, each light a promise that forgetting will not return. Children visit from nearby schools, running their fingers along the carved words on the memorial stone. They ask who Lady Adeline was, and we tell them. A woman who learned too late what her family had hidden too long, but chose truth when silence would have been easier. The soil here grows wildflowers now. Every spring, they bloom over the grave she uncovered, red and gold and white, moving in the wind like slow waves of breath. When the air is quiet, you can almost feel the land breathing easier, as though its long confession finally brought peace. My grandfather used to say that history is not what we inherit, it is what we choose to confront. And standing here, surrounded by the whispers of both the living and the gone, I know that to confront truth is the beginning of healing, not its end. The past does not need to vanish for peace to exist. It only needs to be seen. If you have listened to this story, if you have felt even a fraction of what was buried beneath these fields, then carry it forward. Tell it. Share it. Let it remind others that silence feeds the same darkness truth seeks to end. And before you go, remember that voices like these survive only when people choose to keep them alive. So, if this story spoke to you, subscribe, like, comment, and share it. Let others hear it. Let the memory reach further than the soil it was born from. Because the past only truly dies when no one remembers. And here, on these fields, the earth itself remembers.